Hello, people. Welcome back to another video by your good friend, Chad Marco, the big Aniki. Make sure you guys attack that like button and check out my other social media. And let's have a conversation. It's going to be a good one. So you guys know a while ago, I put out a video. I think it said, what, broke people shouldn't have kids or something like that. I know it's kind of controversial take, somewhat. And then what was the other video I put out soon after that? Oh yeah, there was a video where I was talking about people who regretted having kids. And so I've talked about natalism versus anti-natalism a few times on my channel in the past. And so this is going to be another video about or pertaining to that topic, because I was on X and I noticed that an old YouTuber who was banned from YouTube years ago basically made a resurgence on X. And I don't know if you guys know about him, but his name is Stefan Molyneux. I think he's from Canada, but he kind of he presents himself as being like a modern day philosopher. And I remember when I was getting into self-improvement and just trying to understand the world a little bit better, he was one of my favorite YouTubers at the time, during like my early 20s and whatnot. And really, I mean, this is one of the most the worst examples of like a great content creator being banned from YouTube. I mean, this guy had great content, my God. But anyway, on X, he's basically made like a little bit of a return. You know, he's still been on the internet, but he's been away from like certain platforms, but he's been on X. And so I've been following him, and he's he's wasting no time to get right back into action. But one of the topics that he kind of brought up is natalism versus anti-natalism, or not even really anti-natalism, more so like measured natalism. I'll put it like that. And for the sake of this video, I'm going to call people like him extreme natalists, because I think his perspective kind of goes beyond even natalism. So if you guys don't know, natalism is essentially like people who believe in reproduction, people having kids, nothing bad, nothing against that. And then you have anti-natalism, which are people who believe that, you know, human beings shouldn't reproduce, life is meaningless and suffering, so don't reproduce, right? So you got two extremes here. And me, myself, I've never really been an anti-natalist. I just consider myself to be someone who doesn't really want kids. I never really wanted kids, but I'm not completely against it either. You can say, like I said before, like you could consider me like a measured natalist, where if I were to have kids, it would have to be under circumstances that would be to my liking. But this conversation is kind of about the extreme natalist versus the measured natalist idea. And so Stefan Molyneux, his position in this discussion is basically extreme natalism, which is basically have kids no matter what, no matter the circumstances, don't think about it. Don't think about the future, just make sure you do it no matter what. And we're going to be looking at different posts or tweets from X pertaining to this discussion or debate, if you will, and I'll be giving my perspective on the way. So we're gonna be seeing a perspective really of both sides. And in this discussion, I'm not trying to throw shade at anybody. Again, I got a lot of respect for Stefan Molyneux. I just think this is an interesting discussion. And really, I want to get to the core of why we tend to think so differently on this particular topic, as far as like the group of, again, measured natalists and extreme natalists. So let's get right to it. So this is one of the posts from like probably the middle of the discussion. I wasn't able to keep up with everything, so I'm gonna try to get to like some of the main good posts for conversation's sake. But you see here, he's saying, look, children, despite unimaginable poverty. And so you see here, like, you have these people, oh God, damn. So essentially the reason why he's bringing this up is because you guys know that we're having a fertility crisis in many different first world countries. And one of the reasons that people give for not wanting kids or postponing having kids is because they want to do so under like good conditions. They want to make sure that their money they want to make sure that they're financially stable. and that they have a good partner and things like this. Now, obviously, we live in a time where that's becoming harder and harder to secure, at least based on the standard that we're used to. The economy is getting worse in several countries, significantly worse. Rent is becoming damn near unaffordable for the average person. And then when you talk about like mate selection and how that's become much more difficult, that's part of the problem too. And so these are the things that people are talking about when they talk about like why they don't want to have kids. And again, Stefan's stance, which I disagree with, is just to have kids no matter what. Now, when I look at this, right, you know, because it's essentially a big part of his argument is that you can't use lack of finances as an excuse, because the people that came before us, many of them didn't. They had children regardless of, you know, the circumstances that they were in. But I think clearly our, you know, measured natalists, people of our generation, we live according to a completely different standard. You know, we don't we don't aspire to live in a dirt hut for our children, you know. And really, I think that a lot of the concern that people have really just comes from a good place. You know, you don't want your kids growing up in poverty or a bad situation, you know, and that's where a lot of that stems from. Let's keep going. And so here he is again. He says, I have no patience for people who complain that they are too poor to have children. Go talk to your ancestors who lived on tree bark and snakes. If they had your excuses, you wouldn't even exist. Pay it forward. So, you know, he's appealing to the past and your ancestors with this particular argument. And the reason why I disagree with this is really several reasons. I think one, like when you look at the part that the last part there where he says pay it forward, you know, and you know, I've followed this discussion quite a bit, and you guys can find it on my X. Just go through my posts and you can see like the web of this discussion. It was a great discussion, like so many people involved. But the reason why I disagree with it, or one of the reasons I disagree with it, is again, pay it forward. What he does in his argument is that I feel like he attributes a level of nobility and intent behind the reproduction of our ancestors that's not really there. And what I'm saying is, you know, he says it as if our ancestors, despite all the poverty and the bad things that they were going through, like they felt a duty and an obligation to have kids. And I will argue strongly against that. I think that for most people who reproduce despite going through hard times, I think that they were compelled mostly just through lust and the desire for sex and things like that. Because you got to think about, you know, how people lived in the past. They didn't have Netflix, they didn't have video games and all the entertainment and distraction that we have today. You know, they had work, sleep, they had work, sleep, and fucking. So I think for a lot of people, reproduction came from, you know, them just wanting to enjoy the pleasures of sex and companionship and, you know, things like that. And I think also when you look at how people lived in the past, there was also a greater need for, I wouldn't say free labor when you're talking about kids, but, you know, a lot of people, they were like farmers, or, you know, there was a time when you could send your kids to go work in factories when they were like 11, 12, 13 years old. Of course, we don't do that now. But what I'm saying is, like, another part of the incentive to have kids was that you would have someone to take care of you or to help out around the house or the farm or things like that. So again, I'm just saying that I don't believe this whole idea that our ancestors, you know, were sitting there in deep contemplation, like, man, life is hard. It's so hard, but I must keep the bloodline. Now, of course, you had people like that. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that nobody thought of it like that. Like they had a desire to continue their bloodline. But again, like I said, we're talking about a time where, you know, people didn't have easy access to contraception, condoms, and of course birth control, but they still wanted to enjoy themselves in some way. And there wasn't a lot of vices floating around. Again, you maybe had alcohol, a couple drugs, and there was sex. Sex has always been one of the biggest vices. So again, this idea of, you know, our ancestors, like they put so much thought into it. And even with myself, you know, when I think, like, even my mom, I know this sounds cruel, but it's true, and I don't blame her for it. But even she said, if she could turn back the clock, she would have never had kids. And, when I look at my dad and my mom and their relationship and like their reasoning for having kids, again, there wasn't thought put into it. They were attracted to each other. They thought they were in love with each other. It was lust. It was emotions. It was primal. And then here I am. And I think that's the case for a lot of people. So again, I feel like his argument there is very weak. Not saying that there weren't people like that, but I think a lot of reproduction of the past stemmed from people just pleasure seeking, as opposed to feeling the need to fulfill some sort of like duty and obligation to their ancestors. But also, I would also say that I think that that this idea that we have to do something because our ancestors did it, I think you can poke a lot of holes in that, right? Because you look at it like, well, our ancestors, they thought that it was okay, or at least white ancestors. But really, no, let's be fair. Most races practice slavery to some extent. But let's say all our ancestors thought slavery was okay in one form or another. So because our ancestors practice slavery, we should do the same thing. Now, obviously, that's kind of an extreme example. I'm just saying that's one of the holes in that argument. The idea that we have to do something because our ancestors did it. We are a new generation of people. We live according to a different standard. We're not them, and they aren't their ancestors. Every generation kind of stands on its own in terms of like its own perspective and standard of living. And so I think this guy is someone who is probably more like on the measured side. So let me read this. It says, "This is silly. If we could trust public education, our communities, and our culture, having children under poverty would be a non-issue. People with high standards want to raise children in healthy environments. It is expensive to segregate your children from the riffraff of global..." I'm not going to say that on YouTube. "Think private schools or an expensive house in a good school catchment. What is the use in having a family for the sake of satisfying your own ego? People who had good childhoods under prosperity want the same for their children. Having children and having to work yourself to death to support them. Bad parental support as you have no time for them. Having children cheaply, bad education, bad social circles, and therefore contributing to slop culture. Not everyone can have a career in a cheap, untarnished rural town, which would be ideal for cheap and quality child rearing." So this guy is basically talking about, on one hand, our perspective in terms of like, of course, we live according to a completely different standard than people who came before us, and we have different expectations about what we would want for our kids. At least those of us who are probably more intelligent minded or thoughtful about these kind of things. Some people don't give a damn. But as you can see, he brings up things like, the quality of education that your kids would receive. He talks about their environment and things like that. And I think this is kind of a personal topic for me, because I grew up in an environment, you guys know, in the Black community, that's one of our biggest issues, is people just having children without putting a lot of thought and planning into it. And I see it all the time, how those children suffer and how they never reach, or it's very difficult for them to reach their full potential because of the environment that they're brought up in. And I think that's why, someone like myself, again, I'm not definitely not on either extreme of the natalist argument, but definitely more measured, where, again, if I wanted to have kids, I want to make sure that I have the finances to put them in a better situation than what I grew up in. And I think that's the motivation that a lot of people have. And like he said, man, it's like, you can't understate what it is for a child to grow up with a lack of those things, a lack of good food that doesn't have the toxins and the poisons and the dyes in it. Living in a neighborhood where you don't have to worry about them getting shot because they're playing basketball at a park or something like that. These are the things that people who are more thoughtful about these kind of subjects think about or are concerned about when it comes to having kids. And then he says, people inherently want kids and families rather than blaming those who don't. Maybe the system is broken and needs remediation to promote families. Simply adding meat to the meat grinder won't fix anything. I think what he said in the end there, it says a lot. It really says a lot, because I think that's how our generation feels, is that there's a certain like pointlessness to it. And I think, he brings up the system. And I think that's a big part of why, when people wonder why we aren't having kids, why we aren't starting families, I think that's a big part of it, because we live in a time where it's become so much more obvious that the governments and the systems that we live in and under are very corrupt, and that there's a lot of things that are done to exploit and take advantage of us. And I think a lot of us just don't feel like it would be good to bring children into a world like that, and then for them to be subject to a system like that where this is kind of an extreme example, but you look at the war in Ukraine, for instance. Now imagine you had kids in the Ukraine, and then as they're becoming adults, now you have this war, and because you have this corrupt Zelensky regime that is blocking off people from leaving, now they can kidnap your child off the street and force him into a war that, I'm not going to explain why the war is so fucking fucked up, but it just serves as an example of like what people are concerned about, like the times we live in, and to bring children into a time like that where anything can happen in terms of the system doing things to their detriment and you being powerless to stop it. And so this guy says people are hedonistic today. Children get in the way of that. And I think this is interesting because, like I said before about our ancestors, to act as if they had children, like them having children didn't have anything to do with their own hedonism, is really silly. And I see that all the time. Again, when we talk about my community, the reason why you have a lot of broken homes and things like that is because of people pursuing hedonism, but in the form of sex. Now they end up reproducing or having children in the process, but you cannot separate hedonism and childbirth. As crazy as that sounds, if you really think about it, you can't separate the two, because childbirth is often associated with the mindless pursuit of sex. Again, lack of planning and thought in terms of like mate selection and how you're going to take care of them. I see that all the time. So when I see a comment like this, that's what's kind of interesting about it to me, because to me, I see childbirth and hedonism being closely attached. But, I will say that, for some people, the freedom of being child free is definitely an appealing part of it. But then I think when you talk about the freedom of that, it's not just the freedom to do drugs or to drink or to have sex willy-nilly. The freedom that you have in terms of not having kids can also mean more activities that are more meaningful, activities that could mean, you contributing to your community or helping people, or the pursuit of fine arts, things like that. So being child free and enjoying the freedom that comes with that, it doesn't have to be all about the pursuit of hedonism and pleasure. But I like a little bit of that. I'm not gonna lie, I think we all do. And so Polyvis Gazelle says, I have no patience for people who complain they are too poor to have more than 7 children. Go talk to your ancestors who had 20 children. So he's being tongue in cheek there. But I think this is kind of funny though, because this is one thing that I noticed about this argument is like people, they draw the line between kids and no kids. But I always wonder, like, why isn't there an argument for how many kids you have? So why is it okay for me to have 1, but instead of say 3 or 5 or 6? I mean, if you think about it, if a man and a woman come together and they have 1 child, that's not really a equal replacement for those 2 people. You would have to have at least 2 children to replace the 2 people that made the 2 people that would be reproducing. Now, if you had 3, now you are above replacement. So I would say if I was going to argue in favor of extreme natalism, I'm saying you got to have at least 3. Because that's 2 to replace and 1 just in case. That's what I would argue for. And so Anderson says, we had 4 kids immediately and no money. It all worked out eventually, and it's nice to have them for longer in our lives. Kids don't really cost that much if one spouse can stay at home, even work part-time at home for 10 years. Then it's freedom. So here you have an example of someone who said, fuck it, but it worked out for him. And again, I'm not like pulling his card to, to talk shit or anything, but I'm just saying, like, based on Stefan Molyneux's model or belief, this is an example of when it works out. So, with everything that I'm saying, I'm not saying that like there aren't people that eventually figure things out. There are those that have kids and, they might not be in the best of circumstances, but they grind, they work their way through it, and they put themselves gradually over time in a better situation. Even with myself, when I think about it, my mom started off single mom in the projects and then leveled up to living in the country and then leveled up to living in the house that we live in now, which, this isn't a great neighborhood, but we're not in the projects. And as I got older, I realized how my mom working so hard to put us in the neighborhood that we're in now, that kind of insulated me from like the core of like the projects and like the gangs and things like that. Like, so even my own situation, I can point to how my mom worked hard and put us in a better and better situation. Now, there were other things that worked against our favor, right? Like crackhead step niggas. But still, again, this just serves as an example though of what's possible. But I always have to throw in the fact that, for everyone that figures it out like this, there's going to be someone that doesn't. And I think it's fair to say most people who are born in poverty or whatever class they happen to be in, they tend to kind of stay in that range for the duration of their lifestyle. So, but still, this is a bit of hopium for people who would take that route, because it is possible. It definitely is. So Camo Aquatis says, it's nice to have you back, but it's also revealed that a lot of your opinions are obsolete. Our ancestors had community and freedom, things that can't be measured in economic units and aren't available today. Family formation is a group problem and would need a group solution. And this is going to sound crazy, but it hit me when I was watching this discussion. What he said here, our ancestors had community and freedom, things that can't be measured in economic units and aren't available today. This discussion made me think of what Ted Kaczynski was talking about in his manifesto, the Unabomber. Now, obviously, crazy person, but, he did match up a lot of things or like made predictions or was able to see things that were happening in society that are even more exacerbated now. But one of the things that he talked about was the power process. And what he means is the power process is like the lifestyle of a human being that has to fend for himself. So it's a harder lifestyle where, you have to get your own water, get your own food, build your own shelter. Maybe you live like a small tribe, a small community, but you are in control of the power process. You're in control of your life. It's a harder life, but you're in control of everything from how you sleep, how you work, how you eat, everything. And now we live in a society where we don't really have that more and more. And again, when people bring up things, my bad. But again, when people bring up the system, I think it's very important, because really what they're talking about is how the power process has been taken away from us. I'll give you the perfect example. When you look at the situation where fathers, for instance, aren't able to see their kids as much as they want to or the way that they want to. We see this all the time where maybe a man and a woman, they go through a divorce. Maybe the woman is vindictive and evil and, she's trying to take the kids away from the man. And now the man has to go through the court. He has to go through the system in order to see his kids. Now, if there is no system or like a reduced involvement of the system, then you don't have those issues. The man is more in control of being able to see his kids and control the situation surrounding his kids. DDG, the streamer, just very relevant example of that. Someone who just recently had a child And now because of the issues with the mother of that child, you know, he's not able to see his son as much as he wants to. So again, it's like the power process has been removed from human beings. And I think that's part of what is making people not want to have kids. Because like, even if I have kids, how much do I really control and own them? You know, can I control the medical procedures that they might have to undergo just to go to school or to keep their job? It's things like that people are thinking about that has people concerned. But I thought that was very interesting because it made me think about Ted Kaczynski and what he said about the power process, because I think that's relevant to the discussion. And so Chain Bear here says, same with people who say they can't afford to have kids or can't afford to have more than one or two. It's all bullshit and narcissistic. They just don't want to not be able to go on 4 vacations a year, buy new cars every 2 years, and live in a 9,000 square foot house in a city. You know what's funny about this guy though is that he even called out the can't afford to have more than one or two. I'll at least give him credit for that because a lot of people, they draw the line between kid or no kid. But he said, nah, 1 or 2, not enough. Not enough. So, you know, I'll give him credit for that. But, man, I got to be honest. I feel like when you throw that word narcissism around, I don't think it really sticks, to be honest. Because I think, like I said before, a lot of the motivation for people not to have kids or not wanting to have kids is genuine concern. I think, again, people are really underestimating like how, like, you could say we're programmed, but just the mentality of people who live in a first world country, like that whole idea of, you know, I'm gonna work hard so my kids can have a better life than me. That's why this, you know, again, I have nothing against people wanting to have kids, but when you try to shame people for wanting to postpone having kids or not wanting to have kids because they don't want them in a bad situation, or they want to make sure that they can set them up for success in the future, to me, that's madness. I mean, it goes against everything that I thought was like logical and rational about having kids. You know, it's like, you don't want to have kids when really you don't want to do anything when you're not ready or can't afford it. It's just like if I told you I'm working at McDonald's, but I just put a down payment on a Lamborghini or a sports car or Bugatti, Andrew Tate, you would rightfully call me fucking stupid. And why? Because it's going to cost a lot of, like, basically it's going to be costing me a lot of money just to have a fancy car when I'm not making enough money to really maintain the car itself and the payments. And the same logic can be applied to having kids, you know. Now, if you're going to accept food stamps and Section 8 and live in the projects just to have kids, that's one thing. But like I said, man, I don't think it has anything to do with narcissism. I think it's legitimate concern that people have about the quality of life that their child would have according to the finances and the, just as important, the quality of the mate that they might have. And so Rob Caldwell says people who have money end up spending beyond their means anyway. Have kids now and you realize how much you don't need half of the shiny shit. You'll be fulfilled instead of trying to fill an unquenchable void of dopamine. And then Patrick Terry says, to be fair, I don't think most of us, my generation X, were anything close to ready when we first had kids, but we made it work. And from the moment those kids were born, we couldn't possibly imagine life without them. So now what stood out to me about this was that he said we made it work, right? Gen X. And then when you look at the kids running around now on fucking Zoloft and SSRIs and shit. I mean, not to put the Zoomers down, but I'm just saying, like, because there's so much to be said about this new generation of kids, even millennials and whatnot, and how fucked up they are. Or the assortment of like mental health issues and oh my God. And then to say, but we made it work. I mean, you survived, you know, y'all didn't like die of poverty, but I mean, there's so many different other issues that are going on with the children that, you know, came from this generation of people that could be pointed to. You know, right, the first guy, he says at the bottom, you'll be fulfilled instead of trying to fill an unquenchable void of dopamine. But I think that's something that varies person to person, to be honest. Because you do have some people like they just don't feel fulfilled unless they have kids, you know. And there's something to be said about that, because there are those types that are just like constantly chasing things. When maybe if they did have kids, it would kind of end the need to do something like that. But I've never really related to that. My happiness has always been like just much more simple and whatnot. So I can't really relate to feeling like a void of a child or anything like that. And so Blockchain, it says, this is an out of touch boomer opinion. And I do think that it's quite boomerish, to be fair, because it kind of reminds me of Jordan Peterson, you know, when he was talking about guys like MGTOW, red pill men and things like that. And I don't want to misquote him, but I did a whole video talking about it. I kind of forgot the details of it. But essentially what I realized about people like Stephen Molyneux and Jordan Peterson, and this is some real shit, I think this is part of what it comes down to. And this is why I don't respect the opinion, to be fair. I think these guys are very aware of the changes that are happening in our society, not just in terms of the economy, but in men, to be fair, in men, but for this discussion, women. When you talk about like guys going their own way and whatnot, because that's another half of the reason why people don't want to have kids and start families, because they're concerned about getting divorced, child support, and just, you know, a lack of, or perceived lack of quality mates, women being picky, hypergamy. It's a lot. And these guys, you know, they're aware of it. And I will say, at the very least, I've seen Stefan kind of criticize women and talk about it. So he's aware of it. But then I think to tell men to still engage with these bad options, with these bad systems, that's where I draw the line. Because it's like they're aware of it. But I think that they know, and this is, I guess this is the difference in our mentality, is like they know that it's not going to get fixed anytime soon. But they're still pushing men into engaging with these systems, into getting tangled up with these toxic women who might not be good mothers, or who might divorce you and things like that. There was even one of the posts in this discussion where a guy was like, yeah, I got divorced. Yeah, I'm on child support. Yeah, but it was all worth it. I'm like, fuck that. I'm like, fuck that shit. But yeah, I do think that's, you know, again, it's like, if I had to like frame it in a certain way, I would say it's like being on a sinking ship. And it's like, how do you respond to being on the sinking ship? And I feel like people like myself, we're like, well, look, the ship is sinking, so I'm just gonna go do whatever I want to go do. And people like Stefan or Jordan Peterson, those type of guys, they're like, look, I see that the ship is sinking, but I still need you to mop the poop deck. I still need you to clean the bathrooms. Now see, it'll be one thing if they were saying, let's fix the ship, let's repair the ship. But I think they know that that's not going to happen anytime soon. So instead, it's almost like they're expecting people to go about life as if nothing is happening, as if everything is still, or, you know, just go with the flow. Again, we're on the sinking ship and they're telling you go clean the bathrooms, prepare the dinner, and we're like, dude, fuck that. I'm about to build a lifeboat out of kitchen tables and chairs. And I think that is the divide in mentality. And I feel like, you know, guys like Stephen Molyneux and things like that, maybe they're genuinely concerned and they're trying to reach younger people and convince them. And they'll probably reach some people with this way of communicating. But I feel like there's a lack of like effective communication when you rely completely on bootstraps, you know, bootstrap arguments, you know, appealing to past ancestors and things like that. It's not going to work on motherfuckers like me and things like that. But let's keep going. And so Carl Greenwood says the state is far worse for family than snakes. So again, this goes back to what I was talking about earlier, the power process, because that's really where the state is getting in the way of people having kids, or at least having power over, their household and how they want to take care of their kids and things like that. Even when you think about, like, another good example, the transgender issue, where you might have one parent that wants to go along with the transition. Like, maybe, again, the child might think that they're trans. The mother wants to go through with the transition. The father doesn't. Now what? Now the court got to get involved. And then that's the state. The power process is taken away from the man, or the parent, the unfortunate parent that's not in favor of what the other parent wants to do. So that's where the state comes in. And then, let me see. Marna says, I really respectfully disagree. We want our families and children to have a good life, not struggle in poverty. Yes, we need to increase the white birth rate, but let's not glorify poverty. Let's give our children comfortable lives. Now, the reason why I brought this up is because he said the quiet part out loud. Yes, we need to increase the white birth rate. And this is a very important point that I'll make on this, and maybe even the last point. I think this is very critical. I did not see this type of extreme natalism pop up until white, or what were once predominantly white countries, start to deal with this mass immigration. You have a large influx of Muslims in Europe nowadays, from like France, Britain, UK, things like that. And over here in America, we have the Hispanics, the Haitians and whatnot. And you look at these conversations online, in spaces where they won't be censored, where they can talk freely about these things. You can see white people are very upset about what were historically predominantly white countries. They're upset about, it basically being slowly encroached upon by other races, other religions and things like that. They feel like their culture is being, diluted and pushed to the side in favor of another. And again, the state is not only opening the borders and facilitating this influx of foreigners, they tend to take the side of the foreigners on a lot of issues as well. We saw this in Great Britain during those so-called race riots and things like that. Certain laws that they've made. And white people are, quite frankly, they're upset. And I think a lot of this, because again, this is another thing I noticed. Like, I don't see black people, I don't see Middle Eastern, I don't see Asian people talk about this as much. Now, of course, you got like the declining birth rate, like Japan and whatnot. So it's not like it's only affecting white people. But in terms of like, being specific about we need to increase the white birth rate, I think a lot of it has to do with that. A lot of it has to do with mass immigration. And the reason why is because with these foreigners, they tend to reproduce more. They tend to have more children. A lot of times when they come to these first world countries, they are somewhat dependent on government assistance and things like that. And so the taxpayers, again, predominantly white, middle class, they're footing the bill for these government assistance programs that are, keeping these people housed and fed and able to reproduce like rabbits, basically. And I think what is happening, and it's kind of interesting when you think about it, because has always been a connection between intelligence and either not having kids or having few kids, or at the very least, planning your parenthood, putting a lot of thought and planning into having kids. This is a marker of intelligence, being able to think steps ahead. I remember someone said once, intelligence is being able to predict the future or something like that. But, this is a marker of intelligence, of intelligent type people, and I'm not trying to toot my own horn, but people have always kind of seen me as being like a little bit above average in terms of like the intelligence of my environment, in like the ghetto and the black community and whatnot, which is fair. And I don't think it's a coincidence that I have this kind of mentality of, I shouldn't have kids unless I'm ready. And then when you look at a lot of my peers, they don't think like that. You know, they've been having kids and they were 18, 20, 21 and shit like that, but they clearly weren't ready. But what's happening is that when white people were isolated or more isolated in these countries that they dominated, they could afford to, you know, plan ahead and, you know, I might have one kid when I'm 27, you know, they could, or two when by the time I'm 32, and I'll get a house and I'll make sure, you know, Mary, she's completed her bachelor's degree, and like they could do that. That was one of the luxuries of being in a first world country with first world people, was that you could do that. And yeah, maybe the birth rate slowed as people became more intelligent and put more thought into preparing to have a family. But when you're not competing with other races in terms of demographics, then you can kind of get away with that. But I think what's happened is that for a lot of white people, they're realizing that, you know, these foreigners are coming into the countries that they used to be the dominant force in, and they don't give a fuck about planning, about how much money they got and none of that. They're gonna have 4-5 kids regardless. And I think it's kind of forced white people in particular to feel the need to kind of really go backwards and adopt a sort of like reproductive strategy that mirrors the foreigners that are coming into their country. But I don't think that's the only factor. I've seen so many white people bring this up. That's why I do think that this is part of it. But it's like when you look at a place like South Korea or Japan, where they've been having issues with birth rate before. Like in Japan now, they're finally starting to open the borders a little bit more and things like that. But they've already been having birth rate issues. So it's not just that shit scared the fuck out of me. But it's not just about trying to compete with foreigners who are reproducing more. I think it's also about the other factors that we brought up before. And the other thing too, before I end the video though, because didn't touch on this a lot in with the post that I had. But, it can't be understated, just the divide between men and women that we're dealing with now, where men don't feel like there are enough quality women that they would want to mate with. Women, because of the sexual revolution and feminism, they're able to freely practice hypergamy. So they have very high standards. And so they're only going to be like a few men, especially women who are going to be earning more money. It doesn't matter how much money a woman earns. She's still going to expect a man to do even a little bit, at least make $1 more than she does, and I think that's a big part of it too, though, is like that divide because of hypergamy and feminism and things like that. And I'm not trying to put the blame on women as I say this. I'm just saying it as a matter of fact of what's going on. But I think, again, this is why people kind of feel like the ship is sinking and it ain't going to be repaired, because we're not getting rid of feminism anytime soon. Women aren't going to just try to be fair and say, well, you know what? I won't be hypergamous. And also you have guys on our end. We're not just going to be like, I'm going to fuck a fat, ugly single mom. Well, some guys will. Don't get plenty of bottle feeders. But, men who are more thoughtful like myself, we aren't going to do that. And I think too, in particular with Stephen Molyneux, and I think one of the reasons why he's so passionate about this, and I'll say this too, to be fair, the problem with people not having kids is that it's never the people who shouldn't have kids that don't want to have kids. That's the thing that I noticed, because not wanting to have kids is usually linked to, again, a certain amount of intelligence, because you have to even have the mind to think, I should wait when I'm ready until I'm ready, or I have enough. I should grind. I should work to put myself in a better position. Then that takes an active mind. That takes awareness. And I think that's part of the reason why Stefan is so passionate about this, because I think he's realizing that what's happening is that the more like conscious and aware and intelligent of us are stepping away from relationships, from marriage, from having kids in the system, because can't afford it, don't see a lot of options in terms of good mates. We see the direction of the system that we live in, the country we live in, going down the damn drain, you know, and, you know, less intelligent people are less aware of these things. They don't care as much about these things. And I think, again, that's the bad thing about it, is that it's rarely the people who shouldn't be having kids that have these thoughts. It's usually people who, you know, to be fair, if they did have kids, even as someone who don't want them or don't think they should have them, would still do better than a lot of the people who are just mindlessly reproducing as a side effect of their hedonism, or a side effect of just, you know, pursuing sex and hooking up and things like that. But that's the video. I hope you guys enjoyed that. I would love to see your comments and perspective on this discussion. It's a very good one. So I'll see you guys later. Johnny.